In 1930, a group of workers in the deep Brazilian jungle had finally had enough. They smashed the clocks, leveled the cafeterias, and sent their American bosses fleeing for their lives. How did Henry Ford's utopia turn into a war zone? To understand the riot, we have to go back to the man who thought he could tame the Amazon, and ended up losing his mind, his money, and his city. How did a slice of 1920s America, complete with fire hydrants, a golf course, and a hospital, end up in the most remote wilderness on Earth? And why was it abandoned, left to be devoured by the jungle? This is the history of when a car company, led by the most powerful industrialist on the planet, tried to build his own private country. The story of Henry Ford's $20 million disaster. By the 1920s, Henry Ford wasn't just a man. He was an institution. He had revolutionized the factory floor with mass production, invented the modern weekend, and quite literally put the entire world on wheels. To a generation that had seen nothing like it, he wasn't just a businessman, he was an architect of the future. But that success bred a dangerous kind of arrogance, the belief that if he could manufacture a car, he could manufacture human behavior. Ford's empire was the ultimate machine of vertical integration. He owned the iron mines, the timber forests, and the cargo ships that moved the ore. He was like a chef who didn't just cook the meal, he grew the wheat, raised the cattle, and forged the very pan he cooked it in. But there was one, critical, inescapable bottleneck that haunted him: rubber. The black gold that sat on every wheel he built was entirely controlled by foreign monopolies, and for a man who owned everything else, that was a weakness he couldn't tolerate. The global rubber market was a cartel, a stranglehold maintained by British and Dutch colonies halfway across the world. They manipulated supply, sent prices skyrocketing, and held manufacturers like Ford hostage. For the man who had perfected total, ruthless self-sufficiency, being a puppet to a foreign price-fixing scheme wasn't just a business problem. It was an insult to his empire, and a dependency he refused to pay for a second longer. His solution wasn't to negotiate, it was to conquer. In 1928, Ford secured a concession from the Brazilian government: 2.5 million acres of raw, untamed Amazonian jungle. It was a territory nearly the size of Connecticut, granted for a pittance of future profits. On paper, it was the ultimate masterstroke of vertical integration. But Henry Ford wasn't just buying land, he was buying a blank canvas to impose his own vision of a perfect, industrial utopia. His vision went far beyond a simple plantation. He planned to build a utopian city for 10,000 souls, a perfect, sterile slice of Midwestern America in the humid heart of the jungle, complete with electric power, modern hospitals, and suburban schools. In his own words, he wasn't just there for the rubber, he was there to develop the land, a grand work of civilization. The dream was bold, impeccably planned, and staggeringly detached from reality. The dream was beautiful. The reality? It would be brutal. The grand dream began to unravel almost immediately. It wasn't sabotaged by rivals or crippled by local corruption, it was dismantled by a fundamental, lethal flaw: Henry Ford's arrogance. Ford famously despised experts. He believed that if a man could build a Model T, he could build anything. So, instead of hiring botanists, tropical engineers, or agronomists, he put the entire operation in the hands of his loyal, Detroit-trained company men, guys who knew assembly lines, but had zero experience in the brutal, complex reality of the rainforest. They arrived in the Amazon expecting to find a factory site. What they found was a chaotic, sentient ecosystem that didn't care about industrial quotas. They looked at the richest soil on Earth and tried to force it to obey the rules of a Michigan assembly plant, unaware that they were about to trigger a biological war they couldn't possibly win. The man tasked with taming the wilderness was a sea captain. A professional navigator of the open ocean, with zero, absolutely zero, experience in tropical agriculture. But to Ford, it didn't matter. He arrived on the Tapajos River with a fleet of freighters packed with everything he'd need: a massive, prefabricated steel warehouse, miles of railway track, and enough heavy equipment to build a factory in Detroit. They were ready to impose raw, industrial logic on the natural world, operating under the delusion that the jungle was just another raw material waiting to be processed. It was an absurdity of the highest order, like trying to assemble a living, breathing, pulsing animal using a car factory's instruction manual. They arrived with the arrogance of conquerors, completely blind to the fact that the jungle wasn't a resource to be tamed. It was an ecosystem waiting to swallow them whole. The strategy was simple, and it was a death sentence. In the wild, rubber trees are solitary explorers, scattered deep in the jungle, hidden by the immense, protective wall of biodiversity. But the Ford managers didn't see a forest, they saw an assembly line. They cleared the land, flattened the terrain, and planted millions of trees in tight, orderly, militaristic rows. They treated the Amazon like a Michigan apple orchard, ignoring the fact that nature has a built-in defense system against epidemics. By creating a monoculture, thousands of identical trees standing shoulder to shoulder, they didn't build a factory. They built a biological buffet. It was an open invitation. Pests, blight, and leaf-devouring insects that had spent centuries looking for a meal didn't just find it, they thrived in it. It wasn't farming anymore, it was an all-you-can-eat feast for the jungle's most destructive forces. The initial clearing was agonizing. The Amazon didn't just resist, it fought back with everything it had. Malaria and yellow fever tore through the camps like wildfire, turning the dream of a new civilization into a desperate struggle for survival. The workforce, promised a utopia, found themselves in a disease-ridden labor camp instead. Back in the nurseries, the catastrophe was total. By the second year, the vast, green hopes of Ford's rubber kingdom were brown, brittle, and rotting in the heat. Thousands of seedlings were dead, their roots choking in the heavy, nutrient-starved soil that the Detroit experts swore would be perfect. The pride of the Ford Motor Company was being erased by the very land it sought to conquer. The dream was no longer just stalling, it was becoming a nightmare, and the human cost was only beginning to climb. But the botanical disaster was only half the story. Henry Ford wasn't just exporting his assembly lines, he was exporting his soul. He famously believed that his real business wasn't building cars, it was the making of men. He set out to mold the local Brazilian workforce into his own image of a proper American citizen, disregarding their culture, their habits, and their history. He treated the workers like interchangeable parts, attempting to retrofit their very lives to fit the rigid, moralistic blueprint of a Midwestern factory town. Inside the city, the freedom of the jungle was replaced by the tyranny of the rulebook. Alcohol was forbidden. Tobacco was outlawed. Even the presence of women was strictly restricted within the town limits. And it didn't stop at the doorstep. Company managers acted as moral police, conducting mandatory house-to-house inspections to ensure every bungalow adhered to Ford's vision of a clean, sober, and productive home. It was a suffocating layer of surveillance that turned a remote outpost into a prison. The absurdity was everywhere, even in the houses. Ford forced his workers into American-style bungalows built flush with the ground, ignoring the traditional elevated architecture that kept families safe from floodwaters and snakes. It was like giving a polar bear a sun-tanning kit. The design was fundamentally hostile to the environment. And it didn't stop at the architecture. Every man was forced to wear an ID badge and punch a time clock, abstract, bureaucratic, and deeply resented concepts that stripped them of their autonomy and turned their daily lives into a mechanical tally. But the final breaking point, as it so often is, was the dinner plate. Henry Ford, a notorious health fanatic, forced a rigid Midwestern diet on his workforce. The menu? Whole wheat bread, canned peaches, and oatmeal. He effectively banned their traditional, protein-rich diet of fresh river fish and local fruits. It was an act of extreme paternalism that ignored the needs of men doing grueling labor in the tropical heat. He wasn't just managing their work anymore, he was trying to control their bodies, 1 calorie at a time. And for the workers, this wasn't health, it was starvation. In December 1930, the suffocating tension finally exploded. The revolt became known as the Cabra Pinellas, the breaking of pots. Armed with their work machetes and fueled by years of resentment, the workers stormed the cafeteria. They didn't just smash the tables, they destroyed the hated time clocks, the symbols of their captivity. They tore down the telegraph wires to sever the town from the world. In one violent, cathartic hour, the utopia was dismantled, and the American managers, once the masters of the city, were forced to flee for their lives into the heart of the very jungle they had tried to conquer. The managers scrambled into the dense, dark undergrowth, hiding in fear for days as the rebellion raged around them. It took the Brazilian army to march in and finally restore order. Ford eventually relented, concessions were made, the menu was changed, and the rules were relaxed. But it was a hollow victory. The ironclad trust between the company and its workforce was not just frayed, it was shattered. The Garden of Eden had been exposed as a labor camp, and the dream of an American-born utopia in the Amazon was officially dead.
Ford didn't just bring machinery to the Amazon. He brought his rules, his values, his obsessions, and forced them on people who wanted nothing to do with them. If you want to see how nature and humanity pushed back against the most powerful industrialist on Earth, make sure you're subscribed to Timer Calls. Because Section 4 is where everything starts to collapse.
While the cultural experiment was ripping itself apart from within, nature was waging a silent, absolute war from the outside. The plantation, designed as an assembly line of rubber, was effectively a suicide pact. By stripping away the protective, tangled diversity of the rainforest to create a tidy grid, Ford's men had built the perfect incubator for disaster. Microcyclus ule, a leaf-blighting fungus, didn't just arrive, it exploded. It moved through the dense, uniform rows of trees like a wildfire through dry grass. The plantation was systematically annihilated, not by human sabotage, but by the relentless, efficient, and unstoppable immune system of the jungle itself. The greatest enemy wasn't the heat, the mosquitoes, or the workers, it was a microscopic fungal blight. Think of the Amazon as a vast, natural defense system. In the wild, rubber trees are scattered like damp logs in a campfire, impossible to set ablaze. But in Fordlandia, the managers had gathered those logs and stacked them into a perfect, uniform pile of bone-dry kindling. The blight was the single match. It didn't just spread, it roared through the plantation, turning Ford's dream of an industrial empire into a smoldering, silent graveyard of rotting wood and lost ambition. This catastrophe didn't just happen, it was engineered. By every measure, this failure should have been impossible to miss. Yet, in one of the most staggering revelations of this hidden history, not a single professional biologist, agronomist, or tropical expert was consulted during the planning phase. Ford, blinded by his own myth, trusted his assembly line managers to understand the complex biology of the Amazon. He didn't just ignore the experts, he treated the very concept of expert knowledge as an obstacle to his vision. It was a multi-million-dollar mistake built on the foundation of total, unadulterated hubris. In a desperate, 11th-hour gamble, Ford abandoned the original disaster in 1934, moving everything 40 miles upriver to a new site, Belterra. The land was flatter, better suited, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the nightmare might end. A few biologists were finally allowed in the room, but it was too little, too late. Even with experts on staff, they were chasing shadows. The blight hadn't just followed them, it had adapted. Every attempt to curb the pests was met with a more resilient swarm. Nature wasn't just resisting anymore, it was actively evolving to dismantle every move they made. Nature had fought back, and nature was winning.
Fordlandia was Ford's most public humiliation. But it was never spoken of again. deliberately buried. Next week on Time Recalls, we explore the connection of Patrice Lumumba, the CIA, and Shinkalabwe, the richest uranium mine on Earth. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.
Even as the vines swallowed his first city, Henry Ford's hubris remained absolute. He was a gambler at a losing table, frantically doubling down, convinced that if he just threw enough money into Belterra, the jungle would finally blink. He didn't see a failing experiment, he saw a hurdle to be cleared with more capital. He remained locked in a stubborn, delusional standoff with the rainforest, refusing to admit that in this game, the house always wins. And here is the final, shattering irony: despite the city bearing his name, despite the millions of his personal fortune poured into the soil, and despite the thousands of lives he sought to mold, Henry Ford never once set foot in Fordlandia. Not once. He governed his tropical empire from a desk in Michigan, treating the Amazon like a pin on a map. A king in absentia, commanding a war he never saw, against a terrain he never walked, orchestrating a tragedy he was too detached to truly understand. The final blow didn't come from a revolt or a fungus, it came from a test tube. During World War II, the rapid development of synthetic rubber completely obliterated the global market. Ford's grand experiment was rendered obsolete almost overnight. He had spent a fortune, broken 1,000 spirits, and fought a losing war against the jungle, only to build the world's greatest candle factory just as the light bulb was invented. The entire reason for Fordlandia's existence had simply vanished. In 1945, the era of the industrial kingpin ended. Henry Ford II took the reins of the company and did what his grandfather never could: he faced the truth. He swiftly cut his losses, selling both Fordlandia and Belterra back to the Brazilian government for a mere $244,200, barely enough to cover the final severance checks for the workers. The massive project, which had incinerated over $20 million of Ford's fortune and decades of human effort, was finished. The forest had reclaimed its territory, and the ledger was finally closed. In a final, damning verdict on the entire, tragic ordeal, not one single drop of latex produced at Fordlandia ever made it into a Ford tire. A $20 million fortune, 1,000 ruined lives, and a jungle scarred, all for absolutely nothing. Today, the ruins of Fordlandia endure. A few thousand people still inhabit the site, some as squatters within those decaying, American-style bungalows, caught between the ghost of a failed dream and a harsh, persistent reality. The town's centerpiece, the Grand Hospital, now stands as a gutted, hollow shell, its materials long ago stripped away by scavengers. It is a monument to an empire that never was, slowly dissolving back into the green. In the end, Fordlandia remains a haunting monument to what happens when raw industrial arrogance clashes with the complex, unyielding realities of culture and nature. It is a stark reminder that even the most powerful visions can be dismantled by the very environment they seek to tame.
Fordlandia still stands today. Abandoned. Rusting in the Amazon. A monument to what happens when unlimited wealth meets unlimited arrogance. Subscribe to Time Recalls for new hidden history every Saturday. And the video on screen right now goes deeper into the hidden world of America's most powerful men. I think you'll find it just as disturbing. I'll see you next Saturday.